One sentence, repeated in more books, documentaries, and comment sections than almost any other line about George Patton. German generals feared him more than any other Allied commander, more than Montgomery, more than anyone. It has been said so many times that it now sounds like something a real German general must have said, on the record, to somebody, at some point. When historians finally went looking for the actual paper trail behind it, in German army files rather than in other people's books, they found something considerably stranger than the legend. We're going to tell you everything about what was actually in those files today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows will complicate the version of this story you already know. Now, if you're still here, let's start with where this claim actually came from, because it did not come from the Germans. Part 1. The specific idea that German commanders singled out Patton, tracked his movements with special dread, and rated him above Montgomery as the Allied general they feared most, traces back overwhelmingly to a single popular source. Ladislas Farragut's 1963 biography, Patton, Ordeal and Triumph. Farragut's book was a bestseller, and it fed directly into the 1970 film Patton, starring George C. Scott. A movie so influential that for millions of people, it effectively became the historical record rather than a dramatization of one. Between the book and the film, the idea that German generals watched Patton's every move with special fear hardened from an anecdote into something people simply assumed had always been documented fact. The kind of claim nobody thought to double-check because everybody already agreed it was true. Farragut's own reliability as a historian is worth pausing on, because it helps explain how a claim like this could take root in the first place. The military historian S.L.A. Marshall, reviewing Farragut's Patton biography at the time, described it as filled with inaccuracies. Farragut was also known for being wedded to a particular thesis about how the war could have ended sooner, an attachment that left him open to the charge of selecting the evidence that supported his preferred story, rather than following the documents wherever they actually led. Years later, the British historian Stephen Dorrell would go further, describing some of Farragut's later work on Nazi war criminals fleeing to South America as relying on unnamed intelligence sources for what he called half-correct tales. None of that proves every specific claim in the Patton biography was invented. It does mean the book that planted this particular myth in the popular imagination came from a writer whose sourcing habits other historians have flagged as loose, long before anyone thought to check his claims about Patton against the actual German paperwork. Part 2. In 2011, historian Harry Yeide published a book that actually did the double-checking, titled Fighting Patton, George S. Patton Jr. Through the Eyes of His Enemies, built on surviving German intelligence records at theater, army, and division level, rather than on what earlier English-language biographers had simply repeated from each other. What Yeide found was blunt enough to state as a direct correction to the popular version. Through the campaigns in Tunisia and Sicily, he found no indication that Patton's enemies had any real idea who he was, let alone that they were tracking him with fearful admiration. His conclusion is worth quoting closely because it goes directly at the heart of the myth this video is named for. One piece of the Patton story is pure myth, that Patton was the subject of close scrutiny by the Germans, who anticipated his attacks in fearful admiration. According to the actual paper trail German intelligence officers left behind, their attention at the strategic level was fixed overwhelmingly on Montgomery and on Eisenhower himself, the men actually making the decisions that mattered to German planning, not on Patton, at least not in the way 6 decades of retellings have claimed. Yeide built that conclusion out of sources most earlier Patton biographers never touched, including post-war interrogation reports German officers gave to the U.S. Army's own History Division, personnel and fitness report files on German general officers, and the surviving intelligence summaries of Foreign Armies West, the branch of German military intelligence responsible for tracking Allied forces in the theater. Those records show the first time Patton's name appears at all in Foreign Armies West summaries was in mid-May 1943, well after he had already left command of Second Corps in Tunisia. And even then, he was described in strikingly unremarkable language, noted simply as an energetic and responsibility-loving command personality. That is a professional, faintly bureaucratic assessment of a competent officer. It is not the language of an army bracing itself for its most feared opponent. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Part 3. None of this means German commanders had nothing real to say about Patton. It means what they actually said, once historians tracked down their post-war interrogations, memoirs, and interviews, is narrower and more specific than the sweeping legend, and arguably more interesting because it is real. Gunther Blumentritt, chief of staff to Gerd von Rundstedt, gave American interrogators a genuinely admiring assessment after the war. The Germans regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man whose operations impressed them enormously, probably because he came closest to their own concept of the classical military commander. Alfred Jodl, chief of the German Armed Forces Operations Staff, called Patton the American Guderian, bold, and inclined toward large sweeping movements, comparing him to Germany's own most famous architect of armored warfare. Heinz Guderian himself, interviewed after the war, offered something close to a professional's salute, saying he had to congratulate Patton on his victories, since he had acted exactly as Guderian believed he himself should have acted in Patton's position. Even Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander in the West, is on record describing Patton simply as speedy in the advance, a compliment about tempo rather than a statement of dread. All three of those men were speaking from genuine authority, not from the sidelines. Blumentritt had spent the war as one of the most senior staff officers in the Western Theater, close enough to von Rundstedt's own command decisions to know exactly which Allied generals actually worried German planning at the highest level. Jodl sat at the very top of the German military hierarchy, running the operations staff that fed Hitler himself the daily picture of the war. Guderian was not simply a bystander offering a compliment. He was the officer most responsible for building German armored doctrine in the first place, the same doctrine Patton had spent the war putting into practice against Guderian's own former colleagues, which is exactly what makes his post-war comment land as a professional's genuine respect rather than a courtesy. These are real, sourced, citable statements. What none of them do, in the actual documents, is rank Patton above Montgomery as the general the Wehrmacht feared most. Erwin Rommel, writing a wartime assessment while recovering from his wounds, actually drew the comparison the popular legend claims does not exist in the form people assume. Rommel described Montgomery as a strategist and a multi-dimensional commander, operating on a different level of the war entirely, while praising Patton's mobile warfare in France as astonishing on a tactical level. That is not Patton outranking Montgomery in German fear. That is a German field marshal placing the two Allied generals in two different categories of judgment altogether, strategist against tactician, a distinction the modern legend has simply flattened into a single, more dramatic ranking that Rommel himself never actually made. Rommel wrote that particular assessment while recovering from the wounds he suffered in a July 1944 strafing attack that had put him out of the war entirely, dictating his observations on Allied commanders from a hospital bed rather than from an active headquarters, which makes it, if anything, an even more considered and less reflexive judgment than a note scribbled in the middle of a running battle. Part 4. So where does Eisenhower actually come into this story, if not as the recipient of some triumphant German confession about fearing Patton above all others? The real, documented moment is smaller, earlier, and considerably more interesting than the myth, because it shows Eisenhower's side of the war working from a hunch rather than from confirmed intelligence. On October 21, 1943, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall wrote to Eisenhower with a proposal, a letter that survives today in the George C. Marshall Foundation's own archives. Marshall suggested that Patton's high public profile and his reputation as an aggressive, headline-grabbing commander could be deliberately used to confuse German assumptions about Allied troop movements and intentions, essentially turning Patton's own fame into a tool of deception rather than simply a battlefield asset. Eisenhower's reply is also on record. He told Marshall the idea had a great deal of merit. That exchange is the real, primary sourced answer to a question the popular legend gets backward. Eisenhower did not react to news that German generals feared Patton. Eisenhower and Marshall, together, decided to gamble that German intelligence would fear Patton, or at least pay close attention to him, and then built a plan around that gamble, months before there was any German document proving it was true. Yeide's research into the actual German side of the ledger found exactly the gap that gamble depended on. Marshall was operating, in Yeide's own phrase, on an assumption for which he had absolutely no evidence, and the German records available today do not show the kind of detailed German fixation on Patton's individual movements that the American side was hoping for when they made that bet. Part 5. The gamble did eventually get tested for real, in the single deception operation most responsible, ironically, for keeping the Patton legend alive today. In early 1944, Patton was given command of the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, a phantom formation that existed mostly on paper, in fake radio traffic, and in a landscape of inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft parked in southeast England, all part of Operation Fortitude South, the deception campaign built to convince German intelligence that the real invasion of France would land at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Putting a general as famous and aggressive as Patton in charge of a fake army group made a kind of intuitive sense, on the theory that the Germans would naturally assume the Allies' most feared commander would lead the main invasion force. The specific subplan behind this deception had its own code name, Operation Quicksilver, and its physical footprint was genuinely elaborate. The Phantom Army Group was placed in Kent and Essex, directly across the Channel from Calais, the exact geography a real invasion force aimed at that target would need to occupy. Reconnaissance aircraft flying over the area when the British allowed them through under a deliberately loose policy of what planners called discreet display, photographed inflatable rubber tanks, dummy landing craft floating in rivers and estuaries, and camps built to look occupied by tens of thousands of soldiers who did not exist. Whenever a real tank in the area had to move for a genuine reason, it was swapped out for a dummy so the count visible from the air never changed. Underneath Dover Castle, 2 full signals units, the American 3,103rd Signal Battalion and the British 3,118th Signal Service Group, worked around the clock through the spring of 1944, generating fake radio traffic in authentic military codes and procedures, an entire army group's worth of chatter produced by a comparative handful of men in a tunnel. On paper, the Phantom 1st Army Group carried an order of battle of 11 divisions, something like 150,000 men who existed only in radio signals and photographs taken from exactly the angle that made them look real. Here is where the documented German timeline actually complicates the story the legend tells about itself. German intelligence, specifically the Western Intelligence Branch known as Fremde Heer West, first connected Patton to the fictitious 1st Army Group around March 23, 1944, through reports passed along by double agents working for the Allies, the most significant of them a Spanish operative the British ran under the codename Garbo. But German analysts did not actually conclude that Patton personally commanded that formation until mid-May 1944, barely 3 weeks before the real invasion, and crucially, well after German planners had already settled on Pas-de-Calais as the expected invasion point for reasons that had nothing to do with Patton at all: geography, prior intelligence, and their own strategic assumptions about where an invasion made the most military sense. Yeide's conclusion on this point is the sharpest correction in the whole story. Patton's presence in the deception was, in his word, incidental to a German strategic error that was already largely fixed before his name entered the German intelligence picture. The popular version has this exactly backward. Patton did not trick the Germans into believing the invasion would hit Calais. The Germans had already decided that, and Patton's name arrived afterward, fitting neatly into a conclusion they had reached mostly without him. The man most responsible for actually convincing German intelligence that Patton commanded that Phantom Army was not Patton himself. He was a Spanish civilian named Juan Pujol Garcia, a double agent the British ran under the codename Garbo, and his own path into the war is stranger than most of the fiction he later helped sell to Berlin. Pujol had tried 3 separate times to volunteer as a spy for the British in Madrid and Lisbon in 1941, and was turned away each time. Undeterred, he simply got himself recruited by German intelligence instead, and began sending Berlin detailed, convincing reports about a Britain he had never actually set foot in, built entirely out of a tourist guidebook and material he found in public libraries. confident enough in his fabrications that a handful of obvious geographic mistakes slipped past his German handlers without raising suspicion. British intelligence finally brought him to London in April 1942, once they realized what he had already built, and paired him with an MI5 officer named Thomas Harris. Together, the two of them invented an entire network of 27 fictional subagents that existed only on paper, and over the following 2 years fed German intelligence 315 letters and more than 500 radio messages, all of it building toward the same goal: convincing Berlin that the Allies' main invasion force, under Patton, was still coming at Calais. Garbo's single most consequential message arrived 3 days after the real landings had already happened. On June 9, 1944, with Allied troops already ashore in Normandy, he told his German handlers that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the genuine invasion, led by Patton's First Army Group, was still to come at Calais. German High Command accepted the report, and it is specifically credited with helping persuade Gerd von Rundstedt to overrule Rommel's own requests to move the powerful divisions held near Calais down to reinforce Normandy, while the battle there was still young enough for reinforcements to matter. Germany rewarded Pujol for his service with the Iron Cross, awarded on July 29, 1944, without the slightest idea they were decorating a man working entirely for the other side. Britain made its own, quieter acknowledgement 5 months later, awarding him the MBE in December 1944, making him one of the vanishingly small number of people in the entire war formally decorated by both sides of it. Pujol himself did not stay in the spotlight his own deception had helped create. After the war, worried that former Nazi contacts might eventually track him down for revenge, he arranged to fake his own death from malaria in Angola and quietly resettled in Venezuela under a new identity, disappearing so completely that even his own handlers assumed he was gone for good. He resurfaced only in 1984, persuaded out of hiding by a historian researching the D-Day deception operations, and lived another 3 years before his actual death in 1988, long enough to be publicly credited, at last, for a deception that had spent 4 decades getting attributed mostly to the American general whose name he had spent the war putting in front of Berlin. The payoff for all of it was measured directly on the ground in Normandy. The German 15th Army, roughly 2 panzer divisions and 19 infantry divisions strong, sat waiting in the Pas de Calais for something close to 7 weeks after the real invasion had already begun, kept there by the belief that Patton's much larger phantom force was still coming. Part 6. It is worth being honest about one more widely repeated line before moving to the verdict, because it is the line that gives this video its title in the popular imagination, and it does not hold up under the same scrutiny as everything else in this story. A version of Eisenhower supposedly saying that Patton's name struck terror in the hearts of the enemy circulates constantly online, attributed to Eisenhower directly, usually with no citation attached at all. Searching for a primary source behind that specific sentence turns up nothing beyond other websites repeating each other, the same pattern that produced the entire myth in the first place. It may be a compressed, informal paraphrase of the real Marshall-Eisenhower exchange from October 1943, or it may simply be invented and then repeated until it calcified into something that sounds like it must have been said. Either way, it cannot currently be traced to a documented letter, diary entry, or memoir passage, and a channel built on real files should say so plainly, rather than repeat it as fact, simply because it is the version everyone already expects to hear. It is worth asking, honestly, why a claim this thoroughly checked and this thoroughly unsupported keeps getting repeated anyway, on this platform as much as anywhere else. Part of the answer is simply that it is a better story than the real one. A single German general admitting fear of one specific American commander is a cleaner sentence than a nuanced account of intelligence summaries, fitness reports, and a deception operation whose success turned out to be mostly a coincidence of timing. Best-selling books and dramatic films do not become popular by including footnotes about which of their claims cannot be traced to a primary source, and neither, if we are being honest, do most of the videos built on top of them since. That is not a reason to keep repeating the claim. It is the actual explanation for why it survived as long as it did. Part 7. None of this makes Patton's wartime reputation fake, and it does not make the Fortitude deception a failure. Patton really was, by the testimony of the German officers who actually fought against him and were interviewed afterward, one of the more respected tacticians the Allies fielded, a general whose speed and aggression genuinely impressed men like Blumentritt, Jodl, and Guderian on the specific, narrow terms those men described. Fortitude South really did help convince German planners to hold divisions in reserve near Calais for weeks after the actual Normandy landings, a strategic success historians still credit as one of the most effective deception operations of the entire war. What the documented record does not support is the specific dramatic claim in this video's own title that German generals ranked Patton above Montgomery in fear, or that Eisenhower ever received and reacted to news that they did. The verdict. What did Eisenhower actually say after learning how German generals rated Patton? The honest answer is that he never received the confirmation the legend assumes he did, because the confirmation never existed. What he did say, in October 1943, months before Fortitude South ever ran, was that Marshall's idea to weaponize Patton's fame had a great deal of merit, a bet placed on an assumption rather than a response to a documented fact. The Germans, who left a real paper trail about Patton, admired his speed and his aggression in narrow, professional terms, the same way one tank commander might size up another, not in the sweeping, existential language of fear the modern legend has attached to their names. And the deception that made Patton's fictitious army group famous succeeded mostly by coincidence, arriving after German planners had already talked themselves into defending the wrong beach, for reasons that had very little to do with him. They remember Blumentritt's actual words, admiration for a panzer general, rather than terror of an unstoppable force. They remember Marshall's letter, dated and archived, proposing a gamble rather than reporting a fact. They remember a Spanish double agent's reports reaching German desks in March, and German conclusions about Patton's command arriving 2 months later, after the real decision had already been made without him. And they remember how easily a best-selling book and a beloved film can turn a professional soldier's respected reputation into a myth large enough to survive being checked against the actual files for 60 years, until somebody finally did. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather serve under Patton, or face him from the other side of the line? Tell us his name and unit in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.